Abstraction is a tremendously powerful tool within written and artistic media. A text can use abstraction to explore a myriad of different ideas, make difficult topics more palatable to a wider audience, and hand-wave unnecessary mechanical details that don't really matter to the point being made. The piece can be about multiple things simultaneously, which is clearly useful, but there's a risk of losing meaning amidst the abstraction. Ideas get obscured by other distractions, and an overarching confusion replaces what should have been intelligible, deliberate commentary. Video games are inherently abstract. What a player is tasked to do and why, or the mechanics of skillful activities like mining or fishing or controlling a ball, or even basic stuff like whether a character actually eats and drinks, are among the details that are often abstracted away as something irrelevant to the experience the developers want the player to be having. This prepares video game players to be accepting of a significant amount of abstraction. But how abstract can it go? The continued popularity of games like Dwarf Fortress demonstrates how visuals only need to be representational enough for players to understand what's happening. A villager can drop off a log at the nearest lumber camp in Age of Empires, and suddenly the player is able to recruit archers, even though that wood is never fletched into bows or arrows. That entire process is simply abstracted away. But would showing it improve the experience at all? Gamblack wants to resurrect the powerful dragons for his own benefit, because he's selfish and evil. And most of the time, that's a strong enough motivation for the player to accept. How he would benefit from a world ruled by dragons is never really explained, but the implication is all that ends up being necessary. This level of abstraction might be too vague for anything murkier than the current tone of the narrative, or perhaps Radon Labs could have gone darker. The newest title from Me Less Than 3, Death of a Wish, seeks to push these boundaries. In August 2018, Me Less Than 3 released Lucah, Born of a Dream, a 2D action game with a distinctive scribbly art style, and a bleak and complex narrative about religiosity, ostracization, and guilt. I made a video about the game at the end of 2020. Don't go and watch it, it's shit. I liked the game, but I found it difficult to beat, and struggled to pass the narrative. Born of a Dream features a punishing corruption mechanic that acts as a sort of timer and live system, which I found very unwelcome. And a lot of the big narrative moments are thick with obfuscation and metaphor. Despite my gripes, and the video's horrendous quality, one of the creators of the game came across it, and found it charming enough to stick with me since then. Upon the release of Death of a Wish, they reached out to me and offered me a key for the game. I mention this now because, while I didn't accept the key, the offer alone was an extremely nice gesture, and might impact my thoughts on the game somewhat. I think I'd still have liked Death of a Wish otherwise, but if you've ever made a purchase based on my review, you might want to get a second opinion just in case. Making a sequel to Lucah, Born of a Dream is an unenviable, daunting prospect. I think that the narrative didn't leave many opportunities to go elsewhere after the ending, and while a prequel could be interesting, there are countless pitfalls that might arise as a result of trying to explain why this setting is the way it is. Additionally, there are some gameplay creases that could easily be ironed out, but a sequel would further require Me Less Than 3 to expand on player and enemy movesets in an unhealthy arms race against themselves. The narrative revolves around a group of young people who have been shunned by a hyper-religious society. The world has been ravaged by an apocalyptic disaster, and now some people's nightmares have been personified, manifested monstrosities roaming the lands in search of prey. A religious organization managed to keep some pockets of humanity safe from the nightmares, but their zealotry soured as time went on, stratifying society into a violent caste system. The player is a part of the lowest caste, their horns permanently marking them as a target for discrimination by the ruling organization known as the Sanctum. Throughout the world, the player may stumble upon a handful of communities lorded over by the local Sanctum leader, each using a different method of keeping the lower class under their thumbs. Among these is the Father, the primary leader of the Sanctum as a whole, and likely the group's founder. The Father seems aware of the Sanctum's inability to deal with the increasingly powerful nightmare creatures battering at their defenses. In an attempt to push the nightmares back, the Father tries to train Christian, a child whose great power might be what the Sanctum needs, but not one the organization would widely tolerate. Christian's horns would typically deny him access to Sanctum territory, and despite the Father's intentions for Christian, he too cannot overcome viewing the boy as only a tool. As narrative devices, Christian and the Sanctum provide a lot of opportunities to play with metaphor and explore difficult topics that video games tend to stay away from, and I think the setting is excellently developed. Calling him Christian is a bit on the nose though, and the player character's role in this is difficult to pass. They seem to just show up somewhere, and their presence causes the balance to shift. There are moments of intensity, nihilistic poetry, eulogies for the self, frustration and fury at the world, but there isn't really a character in there. And yet, they are an effective avatar. The player gets to experience this world as an onlooker, the art style and the archipelagic narrative keeping immersion firmly out of reach. Tragedy can punctuate each named character's story without it feeling contrived or excessive, to me demonstrating the writer's ability to empathize with the player. I do wonder why Born of a Dream wasn't Christian's game, but Death of a Wish is. The new game begins in a very similar place to the previous. Christian awakens from his meditation after finalizing his hit list. Father is the nearest Sanctum member Christian wants dead, and while on the path to his location, the game shows some of the new movement mechanics the player will have access to. In Born of a Dream, the player used their stamina to attack, dodge roll, and run. Having one resource for both offense and defense basically forced the player to employ a lot of hit and run solutions to difficult enemy encounters, since over-attacking would leave the player elbow deep in a monster that'll probably rip their head off. This resource management system has been removed in Death of a Wish, allowing the player to stick more aggressively to enemies without too much risk. Christian can also dash to nearby lampposts, adding another evasion option to the player's toolkit in combat, and allowing the developers to layer exploration in a way that wasn't possible before. Eventually, this dash can be performed without a lamppost, handy for combat, but the exploration implementation is mostly confined to the very end of the game. I think that's fine, really. Death of a Wish doesn't strike me as a Metroid-type experience, although the built-in randomizer does appear contrary to that statement. After the player has gotten to grips with the movement changes, they finally enter the Sanctum facility to end the Father's reign. A short chase ensues, but Christian manages to corner Father in a train car, with only Samael, his most trusted prospect, left to guard him. Father's trust is poorly placed, and before Christian gets a chance to strike down his prey, Samael ends the Father's life. The Sanctum had become stagnant, holding an oppressive grip on the world, but not using that power to make any meaningful change. Samael seeks to bring about that change. He plans to reform the Sanctum under the Black Sun, to embrace the nightmare, so the mighty can rule. The conversation in the train car shows that Christian and Samael are reflections of each other, and the rest of the narrative is very focused on ensuring the player understands that. But before I get much further into it, I think we should make sure everyone can understand what they're seeing. Death of a Wish is a very dark game narratively, and the presentation matches those narrative themes. The game is primarily black, only broken by the coloured outlines of background objects and characters moving through the scene. I like the choice of resolution for the sprites, a contrast of harsh, brightly coloured pixels cutting through the black backgrounds, while also making everything appear prickly and painful to the touch. The characters being only outlines helps to show just how omnipotent the black really is. I'm not a huge fan of the conversation sprites. I think it's a good idea to have them. Differentiating between characters was kind of difficult before, since the colour of their outlines was the primary way to keep track of who was who. But, along with the main menu art, I don't think the style of these sprites is especially appropriate. They have this faux anime look, which seems to have prompted the artist to draw each character in silly anime poses that I find undermine some of the serious and important moments Death of a Wish contains. There's a scene where the members of the Neo Sanctum are conducting a public execution in full view of the town they're bullying into submission. The apparent malefactors each scream their dissent, their conviction not broken by the death sentence hanging over them. And then the camera moves to Christian, hand clasped to his elbow, nervous, or brooding, or insecure. He expresses some kind of internal reluctance, despite his mission leading him here to destroy the Sanctum. The pose is the odd one out here. He should be exhibiting more stress, fear, frustration, not embarrassment. The scene manages to be powerful despite that, and its introduction of Naomi is one of the better side character introductions throughout the whole game. I like Naomi. She managed to stay remarkably positive despite the circumstances, and it definitely hurt to see Christian's actions only make things worse for her. Although this section contains the Crusade engine boss, which is an encounter I had a lot of trouble with. I'm unsure if the reason it took me multiple hours to defeat the Crusade engine was because I was underleveled, or it was overtuned. Maybe I'm just bad at the game, or the abstract outline-only art style hindered my ability to see what the enemy was actually doing. Enemy attacks are typically preceded by an audio telegraph to let the player know that they'll need to react to something. There's usually a small gap between when the sound plays and the moment the player needs to have reacted, and the sprite will also have some kind of wind-up pose to show that the attack is coming. As a result, the Crusade engine's moveset is generally well telegraphed, but sometimes it just doesn't telegraph with enough time for me to actually react, mostly when using the rapid-fire tracking projectile attack. The enemy changes shape and blasts off a bunch of shots faster than I could respond, and if it does this twice in a row, the fight is basically over. Was the telegraph bad? Or am I? I can't really decide. The game didn't have to look like this. The boss didn't have to be a bunch of disconnected blobs. But actually, in some ways, it did. Over on Game Rant, Colin Horgan told interviewer Hank Whitson that this art style came almost out of necessity. Colin thought it looked neat, and they were able to create the sprites at a level that conveyed what they needed to. I am by no means a skillful visual artist. My video thumbnails are easily some of my best work, which is ample evidence for my lack of skill. They're simple and effective, and they break typical thumbnail rules, which keeps them from getting lost in the noise of the homepage, I think. And they came out of necessity. I think they look neat, and I'm able to create them at a level that conveys what they need to. An unusual or abstract style can be a useful crutch, an easy way to hand-wave flaws and expedite posting the bit that's actually worth posting. But in an action game, when something goes wrong, it directly impacts the player experience. I feel like this is an important point to cover, how the nature of creating often leads us to our mechanical limits. How often something that was good enough ends up in the final product. It's important not to get stuck chasing your tail, but redrafts and re-evaluation are vital to a quality product. I think it's massively hypocritical for me to talk at any length about that. The use of abstraction in Death of a Wish is effective, and has allowed the developers to shortcut a variety of things while they were making the game. And I think it's noticeable, and it's infrequently a detriment to the game. This is getting a little introspective. Let's move on to the game's story and writing. One of the first poems in the game is titled A Vision of a Past. This single stanza reflects an instance where Christian was beaten by Father in front of a group of his Sanctum congregation. Father uses religious allusions to justify his actions, as will each of the other Sanctum members the player will make contact with throughout the rest of the game. It goes without saying, but violence against children is cruel and unjustifiable. And I strongly believe that organized religion has been a cancer on humanity for a very long time. So religious violence against children is a very persuasive vilification for me. 8 minutes into the game, and I already loathe these dudes. Well done. Soon after A Vision of a Past, while on the hunt for Father, the player will come across a church filled with hooded people that appear to be self-flagellating. Eventually, this confrontation turns into a fight, and the self-flagellators yelling the word ecstasy before their sprites turn into crucified blobs, and a nightmare spawns in their place. I find this connection of mortification and masochism to be a bit confused. There's no doubt in my mind that some individuals who practice religious mortification of the flesh experience some form of masochistic pleasure along the way. But I don't think that's the common or intended result. Mortification is supposed to be a punishment for sin. The sects of Christianity that encourage their members to self-harm are already weird and deserving of criticism as is. I don't think conflating them with masochism strengthens the critique. Actually, M's have been getting off pretty easy since those Hellraiser films stopped being made. It's about time they got a new source of humiliation. The only major character who uses similar language is the Cardinal, whose role in the game is barely more than a cameo appearance. The player is still required to fight in the Cardinal's child Colosseum. Sarah is still the central character, and all of the Cardinal's congregation are still killed. Michael survives, however, and the rather shocking animation of the Cardinal shooting Michael is no longer present. Instead, the player spends a fairly long time earning the trust of Sarah and her crew before they make their big move against the Cardinal. And Michael becomes the central character in the hunt for the priest. Michael's death in Born of a Dream was a significantly more powerful moment than anything that happens in Death of a Wish. The viscerality, the grief, the fury. The presentation and gameplay evoked it all excellently, and I think Me Less Than 3 tried to split that moment between two other encounters, and neither of them really live up to Sarah's transformation. I understand why they couldn't just have the Cardinal kill Michael again. It wouldn't hit anywhere near as hard the second time around, and no doubt I'd be complaining about how the conversation sprites ruined the atmosphere and impact, and that the game is basically just born of a dream again. But the priest and the sister encounters just do not compare. I don't think either are bad encounters, I want to say, but the presentation and writing is just much weaker. Michael is mute throughout the player's short journey with him. Christian recognizes him by the sound of his weapon, and the two make their way through a once forbidden area to a large facility. Michael runs ahead once the pair make it inside, and the player has to chase him around in order to unlock the room the priest is being kept within. The player can find some of Michael's thoughts while they're unlocking doors that vaguely explain how Michael was tricked into following the Sanctum's whims, turning his back on his sister and friends to try and make peace with the enemy. I think that's what happened anyway, because the player isn't shown anything. Michael has thoughts of shame. Christian sees that he and Michael are scarred in the same ways. Christian tells Michael Michael's own conclusions before he enters the priest's chamber, because the game never stopped to show Michael's relationship with this branch of the Sanctum. It rushed to a moment where the game could say that Christian is aware that his quest to eliminate the Sanctum is self-destructive and possibly world-ending, but he's going to keep pursuing it anyway. And then the player has to fight Michael after he kills the priest, for some reason. At least Naomi's character gets some time to develop. Naomi's kindness and generosity are shown to the player when she instinctively helps Christian find the street he's looking for. Christian doesn't have to say, "Wow, you're really kind and helpful," like he would have had he been talking to Michael. Naomi leads Christian through the city, avoiding Sanctum patrols wherever possible, but eventually the pair stumble upon Samael and some other subordinates. Seeing an opportunity, Christian makes a move, but is stopped by one of the Sanctum soldiers. Before the soldier kills Christian, Naomi jumps in, and things turn to an all-out brawl. Numbers are not on their side, and the pair are forced to flee, eventually leading to the Crusade Engine encounter. After finally defeating the boss, Naomi allows Christian to rest in her bed. When Christian awakens, he finds Naomi on the roof, beside what appears to be the sister's corpse. Apparently, Naomi had some form of relationship with Anna, the sister. But despite whatever relationship they had, when the sister awakens and begins the only turn-based encounter in the game, Naomi is not safe from her attacks. Upon defeating the sister, a long text segment begins. In it, Naomi laments her lost lover. She details the moment the nightmares arrived, and how Naomi's reaction changed so much that the two had to separate. Now, with Anna's death, Naomi blames herself for the breakdown in the relationship, and partly blames Christian for his hand in the events that day. Things end there, with Christian instead being transported to an alleyway and having no conclusion as to what would happen to Naomi. I think there's a lot of potential locked up in this segment, but due to this micro-narrative structure, there's no way to build up to these big emotional payoffs. There's no mention of Anna until Naomi is kneeling beside her body on the rooftop. So what's it all for? Why are so many people dying, friend or foe, for Christian's quest to destroy the Sanctum? I won't show anything to spoil the ending here, because I believe the game is worth playing, despite my nitpicking. As for the messaging within Death of a Wish, I think it's a call to action. Society is at a tipping point, and the powerful among us are only interested in maintaining their power. Something must be done. but it's probably going to be painful. Some goals are bigger than the people who achieve them. Doing the right thing often hurts you and the people you love. Martyrdom is not just a religious thing, and we should not allow the tyrants to take control, even if their rhetorical nightmares aren't entirely fiction. We are shown the Sanctum executing dissenters in the middle of the largest city in the region, in full view of the populace, who make no attempt to intervene. The Sanctum's power is unquestionable, and anyone who does is promptly put to death. The only people capable of challenging the status quo are disorganized, scattered and hunted at every opportunity, fully aware that any effort to change their situation is futile and fraught with pain. But Christian will strive to do what must be done, and each step of the way is met with resistance, and each small victory comes at a grave cost. In the end, none of the people who fought for a better world will ever see it. The tragedy of generational change. We can only hope their efforts won't be in vain. In the end, despite all of the abstraction, the themes and gameplay of Death of a Wish are discernible and poignant. As easy as it would be for the visual and storytelling styles to obscure the game, Me Less Than 3 have managed to keep everything coherent, which is an achievement all its own. While I have some gripes with the narrative presentation, and the speed through which the player is ushered through that narrative, overall I think the story is solid, effective, and meaningful without coming off as preachy or lip service. I do think that the average consumer wouldn't recognize or engage with the various metaphors in the game, since they aren't openly spelled out to the player. But those people aren't likely to play Death of a Wish on account of its art style anyway, so that concern is at least ignorable. Unfortunately, that lack of broad appeal has left Death of a Wish in the fringes. Positively rated on Steam, but with total review numbers similar to The End of Deus, Harlequin Fair, and Orion Legacy of the Koryo Dan. All great games that have been widely overlooked. I'd say, give Death of a Wish a shot. Support a cool indie studio so they can keep making more quality stuff. And stick around for the next video. You voted for it.